Hi. Hello. Today I'm going to be doing a quick review over our second semester CBA. We're going to be going over three things: integers, proportions, and percent proportions. These are the three main things that we're going to be tested over tomorrow and Monday. And so it's important that we kind of try to understand each one of them. Let's start with the one we learned first, integers. And there are basically three main rules you should know for integers. The first one is adding them. And the second one, subtracting them. The third one is multiplying and dividing them. The first rule for adding is actually pretty straightforward. What I like to do is make my students sing the song. You should know it. Same signs means that you add them together and you keep the sign. So for example, if I have a negative and a negative, just add them together and keep it as a negative. If you have a positive and a positive, you can add them together and keep it a positive. So if they're the same signs, you can add and keep. However, if they're different signs, you have to subtract. So if I have a negative and a positive, it'll make a negative. Oh my gosh, I messed up. If you have a negative and positive, you'd really be subtracting these two numbers. Same with if you had a positive and a negative. If they're different signs, you would subtract them. So how do you know which sign to keep? You'd keep the sign of the bigger absolute value. You'd have to keep the sign of the bigger absolute value, and then you'll get the correct answer. So for example, say this was a negative 5 plus 3. Well, I would have to subtract, which would be 2, and then to keep the sign of the bigger absolute value. So which one's bigger, the 5 or the 3? Well, the 5 is bigger, and that's why it would be negative 2. On the contrary, if you had 5 plus negative 3, there are different signs, and so you would still subtract them, but the bigger absolute value here is 5, a positive number, and that's why we'd have a positive answer. Adding, pretty straightforward. As long as you really know the lyrics to the song, you shouldn't have too much of a hard time. Subtracting is honestly the same thing as addition. We just like to do either same, change, also known as add the opposite. So say we have something like 5 minus 3. Let's try negative 5 minus 3. We need to do same, change. So if we leave this the same, we would change the minus to a plus, and then 3 would change to a negative 3. And then we just add like we would. And these are the same signs, so we'd add and keep the sign. So 5 plus 3 is 8. Keep the sign, negative. If we have 5 minus negative 3, we would still do same, change. It'd be 5 plus 3, which would be 8. That's how we would subtract integers. Multiplying and dividing seems to be everyone's favorite because we use our good old friend, the sleepy bear. He likes to sleep in class, he's not very helpful, but he will help you for multiplying and dividing. That's why those are in his ears. If you try to use him for adding or subtracting, he will not be helpful. So basically what we do is we multiply or divide like normal, and then you ask him for help. You ask him, hey, is it negative or positive? And I'll show you how. Say we have 5 times negative 3. This is a positive number, and this is a negative number. So I'd cover up the positive and the negative to have a negative number. So 5 times negative 3 would be negative 15. Say I have negative 2 times negative 4. Well, 2 times 4 is 8. And then I have a negative and a negative, which makes a positive. Positive 8. Same thing with division. We could do negative 25 divided by 5. Well, 25 divided by 5 is 5, but we have a negative and a positive, which would make a negative. Last but not least, say we have negative 5 divided by negative 1. Well, 5 divided by 1 is 5. I have a negative and a negative, which makes a positive. So those are pretty straightforward. Our integers, not too difficult. You have learned them. You did a project over them for some of y'all. You should know it. However, proportions may be a little bit more tricky. You need to ask yourself basically 3 questions. What do I know? This is helpful because it tells us our labels. I'm sorry. The first question is, what are we comparing? This is what gives us our labels. The second question is, what do we know? This helps us set up our baseline fraction. What are we looking for? This helps us basically find out, well, what we're looking for, what the answer to our question would be. And so let me give us an example. It will be coming from our questions. If you don't like that, it will be coming from our review. So if you don't like that, I am sorry. Let's take a look at number 13. It says, at school on Friday, 3 out of 4 students were wearing jeans. There are 600 students at the school on Friday. How many of the students were wearing jeans? So the first question is, what do we know? Well, I'm sorry. The first question is, what are we comparing? This is often the hardest part for students, but it's one of the most important because we need you guys to know, what we're comparing. If you don't know what we were comparing, then it's going to be a lot harder to identify our labels and go from there. So, the 2 things we're comparing here are the students who are wearing jeans versus all the students there are. So, I'm going to write jeans over students. Well, I know that 3 students were wearing jeans out of every 4. I also know that there are 600 students at school on Friday, so I should probably put my 600 where it says students. And then I need to figure out how many were wearing jeans, which would mean I would probably cross multiply and divide. That's because these are proportion, but sometimes it's not as easy to find out how many times 4 goes into 600. By cross multiplying and dividing, I can find an easier way to get this answer. So here's how you cross multiply and divide. 4, I need to multiply diagonals. I can either multiply these 2 together, or I can multiply these 2 together. Can you multiply 4 and a question mark? If you said no, you're correct. I can't because 4 and a question mark, they don't go together. However, I can multiply 3 and 600. So this is what I cross multiply. And then I divide by the only number left over, which is 4. And then I would have gotten my answer, which was B. As long as you're really careful and you know your labels, it should be fine because your labels are the biggest thing that will help you out. So remember, the 3 questions are, what are we comparing? What do we know? What are we looking for? You should probably be able to see it. I'll zoom out. So the 3 questions we're asking ourselves. What are we comparing? What do we know? And what are we looking for? If we do these 3, we will not have any trouble with any proportions. Another question we have is percent proportions. This is the last one, and some students may have difficulty trying to identify, oh, well, when do we use percent proportions? Well, it's in the name. If there's a percent, or if it says percent, or if it says percentage, it's probably a percent proportion. Percent proportion is percent over 100 equals part over whole. This one's one of the more straightforward ones because there's not a label to kind of figure out. It's just more of percent 100 part whole. And so we try to go from there. I'm going to take a look at this one, number 9, to really help us out. It says a shaded area on the grid represents a part of the rectangular wall that was painted. Each small square on the wall has the same dimensions. What percentage of the wall was painted? Percentage. That's what tells me that it's a percent proportion. So I know that my percent is going to be part over the whole. Well, my part here is 24 blocks. The whole thing is 40. And then I know it's percent over 100, but I don't know my percent. But I know that percents are always out of 100. From here, I can just cross multiply and divide. And you should have gotten 60. So please remember the 3 things you should really focus on are integers, proportions, and percent proportions. These 2 are the newest, and so I do understand if you have some difficulty with them. Just please make sure you remember how to set up both of them, because if you know how to set them up and you remember to cross multiply and divide, you should have no trouble. Just really quick on cross multiplying and dividing. So say you have a number and a number and a number. It's really common to just do the diagonals and then divide. But it doesn't really matter how it looks. So you can do this, you can do this. As long as you multiply your diagonals and you divide by the only number left over, you'll never be wrong. So please make sure you multiply the diagonals and then you divide by the number left over. This video is about 13 minutes long and I tried to make it short, but if you have any questions, feel free to email me. You guys know my email. If you don't, here it is. And I'll be happy to answer any of your questions as long as it's before the test. So good luck, happy studying, and I believe you guys can do it. Have a nice night.